Hello and welcome to Forbidden Talk, a discursive programme addressing sensitive social issues in the Middle East. This week we shall be exploring capital punishment in the Middle East and asking whether in this day and age there is space for a secular legal system across the region, a region where much of the motivation for the retention of the death penalty has been religious in nature. Some people think that an adulterous woman should be stoned immediately without trial, while other people think that capital punishment should be abolished, even for those who kill and maim en masse. Capital punishment is a live and contentious issue in the Middle East, causing much disagreement and political confusion. Is the chance of a peaceful debate on the matter plausible? Will the abolition of the death penalty in the area ever be a reality, or is the mere suggestion laughable? We shall be discussing all these questions with experts on the issue, but before we move on, I'd like to welcome my studio guests, Syed Alisar, Middle East analyst, writer and human rights and democracy advocate, and Sadakat Kadri, human rights and barrister at Doughty Street Chambers and author of Heaven on Earth, A Journey Through Sharia Law. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks very much for having us.
But before we move on, let's take a look at this brief report, which does contain images which may be disturbing to some viewers.
Capital punishment is still widely practiced in a number of countries throughout the Middle East, but human rights groups are actively pursuing for the abolition of the death penalty. A number of Middle Eastern nations have emerged at the forefront of an increasingly isolated group of entrenched executioners, fueling the latest spike in global figures. Amnesty International's latest global report on the death penalty documented that at least 23,392 people were facing death sentences worldwide at the end of 2013. Iran, Iraq and Saudi Arabia alone accounted for almost 80% of all reported executions carried out worldwide in 2013, excluding China. An upsurge in executions in Iran and Iraq explains a global rise of almost 15% from 2012. Across the Middle East and North Africa, at least 638 people were executed in 2013, using methods ranging from beheadings and hangings to death by firing squad. Iran is executing at an alarming rate with almost a 20% rise in 2013. Iraq recorded a stark rise for the third year in a row, with at least 169 executions. This is the highest figure since Iraq reinstated the death penalty in 2004. Saudi Arabia also maintained a consistently high rate of executions, with at least 79 executions in 2013. 3 of those executed were convicted of crimes they allegedly committed when they were under 18, a clear violation of international law. Jordan hadn't opened its doors to its execution rooms since March 2006. This was until in December when it hung 11 men, ending an 8-year de facto moratorium on the death penalty. According to Amnesty International, in many cases death sentences are imposed for offences other than murder, falling short of minimum international standards. But when the sentence is given for crimes such as murder or rape, will the concept of capital punishment then be acceptable?
Zaid, what do you feel about the death penalty in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, to talk about the death penalty, we're talking about the capital punishment. And when you talk about capital punishment, it should be related to capital major offenses. That is by definition why it is there. A lot of the countries in the Middle East do not actually give a clear definition to what actually or basically constitutes a capital punishment. There, I think one of the, let's say, mistakes, deliberate mistakes that are left there is basically leaving a vague or no definition at all to why this crime actually warrants the death penalty. It has been abused and exploited by governments to actually shore up and prop up their regimes. It has been utilized as a tool or as an instrument to actually exact revenge or to strike fear in the hearts and in the minds of people who dare to challenge or stand up to the regimes. I think that is the main danger, that it is being exploited by regimes for their own safety and their own basically strength to exact revenge and to punish those people, to make an example out of them so that others are basically are silenced or stifle any sort of defiance against the regime. So it is being used politically, and it is actually being exploited and abused by dictatorial regimes and tyrannical regimes in the region.
Sadakat, abused and exploited? Do you agree
absolutely.
with these words?
Well, I'm a human rights barrister, so
Yes.
I'm opposed in principle to the
opposed
in principle to capital punishment. I mean, I completely understand why historically capital punishment took place. I mean, I'm sure there were very good reasons back in the 7th century and beyond then for capital punishment to be imposed. But in the 21st century, I don't think it's right that states should be given that kind of power over their citizens because of the dangers of injustice. And as Zaid has just mentioned, I mean, the dangers of inconsistency are huge. One sees in Saudi Arabia there was a sudden spike in executions at the end of last year. It's no coincidence, I don't think, that that's a time when the Saudis were particularly worried about having just joined the coalition against ISIS. They wanted to show their population that they were in control, and so they decided that they'd stage a number of public executions to display that.
But what about the massacre of school children, for instance? What happened in Peshawar?
It's an absolutely terrible crime, but the answer to it isn't to do as the Pakistani government has done, to end the moratorium and suddenly to pluck people off death row who've been told for years that there's a moratorium, that they're not going to be executed, and then suddenly to start executing people who had nothing to do with that crime. If they're caught, there are certainly arguments. I recognise that there are arguments for capital punishment, but what's happening is that in order to placate popular anger and in some cases bloodlust, governments are simply selecting people almost at random, criminals almost at random, to execute them just to show that something is being done.
Zaid, you mentioned capital offences, so there is part of you that thinks that maybe this could be a good thing.
No, I'm not saying it's a good thing. It's actually a last resort. That is when a country, by basically agreement, international agreement, becomes the center or the center place or the central area for the fight of terrorism. That is something that all the countries agree. Like, for example, in Iraq, it is basically the central fight in what they call terrorism. But there is terrorism committed on the ground. What I'm afraid of is that there are governments, and particularly now we see, like, for example, the Saudi Arabian regime, which is tying up this to religion, and the West is deliberately being devious about it when they know that it is not called Islamic fundamentalist. Like Marine Le Pen the other day came out of a meeting with Hollande and said, look, you have to tell people who the enemy is in order for them to be able to fight it. And she said it's fundamentalist Islam, and that is tarring all Islam with the same brush. But it is basically what we're dealing with is the backward, medieval, intransigent, intolerant Wahhabi Salafi ideology, which is propagated, exported deliberately by the Saudi government, and it relies heavily for religious legitimacy and religious justification, religious cover-up on that Wahhabi Salafi establishment, which is based in Saudi Arabia. That is the headquarters of that ideology. So the West is fully aware of that. They are fully aware that the ideology is being exploited, and it is being used by the Saudi regime to prop up the regime and to shore up its base and to actually utilize it against those people in Saudi Arabia. Like, for example, the flogging which happened recently in Saudi Arabia. At the same time, it shows the brazen display of hypocrisy, condemning it in Paris and committing exactly
we'll talk about that a bit later,
because it's committed by a government rather than a bunch of terrorists.
Sadakat, I just wanted to bring you in.
If I could just pick up on something that Zaid said. I agree with a lot of what he said, but I don't think that it's fair, really, and I'm no friend of the Saudis, but I don't think it's fair to simply blame it on Wahhabism and Salafism centered around Saudi Arabia. I mean, the second and third the countries which are second and third in imposing the death penalty are Iraq and, of course, Iran. Now, I don't want to venture into the sectarian divide between the two, but there's no argument really for saying that the governments of either Iraq and certainly not Iran have anything to do with Wahhabism or Salafism. Yeah. And so, I mean, there is an important way in which religion is being exploited by these governments, and religiously based rules are have been reinvented over the last couple of decades in order to justify the execution of criminals. But I don't think it's a specifically Wahhabi thing or a Salafi thing.
Yeah, we mustn't forget China and the US.
Well, exactly. China executes more people than than all those other countries in the list put together. And number 5 on the list is the United States, which uses methods like lethal injection, which are at least as barbaric, in my opinion, as beheading. It's not a religious or a secular thing. It is, in my view, in the 21st century, an immoral thing to happen, though.
Okay. Well, joining us over Skype now in Beirut is Lina Khatib, Director of the Carnegie Middle East Center. Lina, why is the US not openly condemning Saudi Arabia for its bad track record of human rights, yet can openly attack Iran?
Well, I think it's very simple. It has to do with the fact that the United States and Saudi Arabia have been political and military allies for a very long time, whereas there are no diplomatic relations between Iran and the United States. In fact, Iran persistently calls the United States things like the Great Satan, and you know, there is a political schism between the two countries that goes all the way back to the start of the Islamic Revolution in 1979.
You mentioned in an article this week published on the Carnegie Center's website, the Saudi regime may seek distance from ISIS, but their justice systems are not dissimilar. Could you explain this in a bit more detail?
The article was part of a campaign launched by the Independent newspaper in the UK, calling for a revision of the sentence of the blogger Raif Badawi, who was flogged publicly in Saudi Arabia recently. What I did in the article was look at the justice system in Saudi Arabia and highlight the fact that it's a Wahhabi Sharia-based justice system that actually is very far away from the concept of justice as it should be. It's a system that's inconsistent, and it's a system that is reliant on brutal violence, very often conducted in public, such as public beheadings and flogging. And saying that right now Saudi Arabia wants to distance itself from the Islamic State and its violent practices and from radicalization and terrorism. And that's mainly because of fear about repercussions stemming out of the Syrian conflict. But when you have a justice system that uses very similar practices to that of the Islamic State, you are basically hurting your own credibility. And this is a key message that Saudi Arabia should think about.
Zad, do you agree with that? Saudi Arabia is in fear.
Well, definitely they are in fear, but they are in fear not for the attention that the West is giving it, or mere paying lip service by condemning them. America tells them, look, we can condemn you. Go ahead, do whatever it takes to shore up your system and your regime, because we desperately need you. Saudi Arabia has been a pillar of not just executing American strategic policy, but actually financing it. Now, going to back to the issue of Wahhabi Salafi Islam, it is basically their own, even Sharia law. People mistake and think they say it also vaguely. Saudi Arabia implements Sharia law. Saudi Arabia implements their own interpretation, their own version of Sharia law, which is the most strict, hardline, medieval form, which is the Wahhabi Salafi Islam. Now, ISIS depends on the same, which is the Americans, something they wouldn't dare say. The same Wahhabi Salafi ideology is the one shoring up and propping up the regime in Saudi Arabia. It gives them the religious cover without that backing from the Wahhabi Salafi clerics. And by the way, ISIL also depends in its attacks or in its beheading. It's not similar. There is no, we can't say it is near identical, and that's a research done by Middle East Eye recently, comparing the sort of punishments dished out by the Saudi Arabia and by ISIS. They are identical, and they're based on the Wahhabi interpretation. ISIS would never exist without the fatwas coming out from Saudi Arabia, giving the religious legitimacy to actually beheadings, decapitations, limb amputations that are carried out similarly by the Saudi regime and by ISIS.
Sadakat, is it fair to put ISIS in the same umbrella as what Saudi Arabia?
Well, yeah,
purports?
I think in many ways it is fair. I mean, the Saudis themselves are clearly embarrassed about the comparisons that are being drawn. I mean, one interesting thing about the most recent execution that happened in Saudi Arabia a couple of months ago, I think it was that it was a woman was, I think it was a Burmese woman, was charged with murder, and she was publicly beheaded.
Yeah, her stepdaughter for raping, for sexually abusing men,
and it was a terrible crime, and she was executed for that. If the Saudis think that that's the appropriate punishment, and they want to show their people, which they do. They're one of the 4 countries in the world which still stages public executions, along with, it must be said, Iran as well, and a couple of other countries. North Korea is one other, and I can't remember the 4th. But if they think that it's appropriate publicly to execute people, then why don't they want that to be shown broadly across the world? But the simple fact is they don't. They've put on trial someone who filmed that execution and has put it onto the internet, and they've charged him with a criminal offence. What are they ashamed of? If they think that this is Quranic, if they think that this is the unchanging word of God, then why don't they just take pride in it? The reason they don't is very simple, because they know it's apparent that it's apparent to anyone with eyes that the similarities between their system of justice and ISIS and the kind of justice that's being meted out by ISIS at the moment is the similarities are very great. I do think that this isn't something that I've got an answer to, because I'm not sufficiently expert in this, but I think that there is an important distinction that needs to be drawn between the judges of the Saudi Arabian system and the executive authorities, the royal family. I mean, there are plenty of other things that could be said about the royal family, their corruption and all the rest of it. They do represent. They are definitely, or some of them definitely are embarrassed about what goes on with the punishments that are imposed. And the blogger Raif Badawi, I personally don't think, and I've got no evidence for this, but this is just a personal point of view, I don't think it's any coincidence that his punishment was called off last week, and it may well be called off again in the future. I suspect that pressure was being imposed by the ruling family.
Okay, well, it was an interesting point. Lina, in response to Janine Di Giovanni's article in Newsweek entitled "When it comes to beheadings, ISIS has nothing over Saudi Arabia," you tweeted, "I will add that the US still uses capital punishment, so like Saudi Arabia, the US also sanctions state violence." Can you tell us why you brought this particular angle up and your thoughts on the matter?
Personally, I am against execution, full stop. I think capital punishment is something that should stop worldwide. And in tweeting that, I wanted to highlight the hypocrisy of the United States in sanctioning state violence. So when, the US condemns, human rights violations in other countries, I also think that it should reflect on its own practices when it comes to state violence. Whether we're talking torture or whether we're talking execution, I think these kinds of practices should never be given the legitimacy of the rule of law anywhere.
And why does it tend to be the executions of foreigners that tend to attract the most media attention and not nationals in the Middle East?
The executions of foreigners constitute only a small proportion of constitutions, generally speaking. I think the added dimension of victimhood there is that these foreigners very often, if they had been caught for the same crimes and charged with the same offenses in their home countries, most likely they would not be executed. And that's why the media attention, I guess, is directed at these cases. But, for every foreigner executed, we have several more nationals who face the same fate.
Well, thank you so much, Lina Khatib, for sharing your views with us.
Thank you.
Zaid, I was looking at your Twitter stream recently, and you actually said identical inhumane punishment under barbaric rule of ISIS and Saudi Arabia. Can you just tell us what prompted you to write this?
Well, basically, I've been following up the issue of ISIS very closely, and before that, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I mean, that's exactly the same organization. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was reeling and on the back foot in 2008. Now, the Saudis have jumped on the chance of actually dealing a devastating blow to their arch-rival in Iran. That is, in trying to topple the regime in Syria, which will do irreparable damage to the strategic alliance between the two. And that's why the Saudis used it as a window of opportunity to throw a lifeline to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which moved to Syria under the name, firstly, of Jabhat al-Nusra. And that is what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, has said, that basically all the resources sent to us by the outside, which means Saudi Arabia and also Qatar, and that's what the New York Times acknowledged, and lately Biden have definitely confirmed by saying our major problem in Syria is actually our allies, naming Saudi Arabia. They are steadfastly determined to topple the regime in Syria and also stir up a Shia-Sunni sectarian war that they actually send millions of dollars to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and he said that specifically, and Jabhat al-Nusra, with tens of thousands of weapons. There is actually striking similarity between the approach of ISIS and Saudi Arabia. They both adhere, as I said, to the Wahhabi Salafi ideology. They depend entirely on fatwas, which gives legitimacy to what they actually do on the ground. Now, Saudi Arabia cannot go as far as what ISIS does, but I do believe that the Saudis deliberately use flogging and beheadings to scare their people off. It's an internal message with total disregard to the outside world.
So in terms of someone not being of that religion, do they have similar thoughts on that?
I mean, no, it would have been actually worse for Raif Badawi had he been a Christian or a Jew or an atheist. He would have been worse. He would have been, his head would have been chopped off on the spot, because Raif Badawi was accused by one of those hardline clerics, which actually, by the way, are government employees. They are paid by the government, so they're not, and they play a major role in the society in Saudi Arabia. The government relies on them. And if it wasn't for Raif Badawi coming up and saying the Shahadatain, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, and Muhammadan Rasulullah, just showing them, because they accused him of insulting Islam. And that's the point I was coming to. There is no definition what is actually insulting Islam. Because what he said is that, look, those hardline guys, those Wahhabi Salafi establishment cannot be expected to run our lives. That was the criticism. And he criticized the religious police. The religious police who impose very strict limitations and on all people living in Saudi Arabia. Let's not forget, there is no church in Saudi Arabia. And although the West have criticized and begged the Saudis, pleaded for them to give more human rights and that sort of thing, because they feel hugely embarrassed. But a fatwa came out by the same guy, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, when he was asked by a delegation from Kuwait, is it allowed for us to build new churches in Kuwait, in Oman and Bahrain? He said, look, by Islamic law, no church should ever exist in the Arabian Peninsula. And that was a clear-cut case of sending out a message to all those Wahhabi Salafi hardliners, go and destroy all churches. And we've seen that happening in Iraq. We've seen it carried out the same bombings and the same anti-Christianity, anti-Shiism, the destruction of all sites of religion or religious shrines in Syria, in Iraq, in Sudan, in Somalia, in Mali, all carried out under the religious justification coming out from the Saudi Wahhabi Salafi, which underpins the regime in Saudi Arabia.
Okay, well, Sadakat, I'd like to touch upon your novel, Heaven on Earth, A Journey Through Sharia Law. You described the early years of Islamic law as being rather fluid, adapting to the demands of the changing world, which is quite a contrast to the rigid picture we get today.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's not a novel. It's actually a history of the development of Islamic law, and in the early years of Islam, I mean, of course, Islam was in a state of flux. I mean, if one looks at the Quran itself, there are only 4 criminal offences identified, and then there's also 4 criminal offences which are made specifically punishable, and then there's also a right to retaliation that's given, qisas, that's given if people choose to exercise it, but at the same time the Quran says that mercy should be exercised because it makes people higher in the eyes of God. But as Islam, as the Muslims expanded beyond Mecca and Medina, and the territory under the control of Islam began to expand, there was obviously a need for more crimes. And so what happened was that scholars began to interpret the Quran, began to develop, began to extrapolate principles, and further crimes were identified. Things like blasphemy, apostasy, even intoxication, which isn't made punishable in the Quran itself, were made punishable subsequently by the identification of hadith stories about the Prophet.
So there was a need for more crimes, you say?
Well, yeah, because that's what states do. States, as they establish control, they lay down rules, they lay down systems according to which people can live. It's a perfectly legitimate way that states operate. I mean, that's what happens. And so the basic point that runs throughout my book, and the basic point that I'm trying to make now, is that the development of Islamic law was a process. It began, of course, in the 7th century, at the time of the Prophet. But it didn't end for at least another 200-300 years after that, and that's the way that it should be. That's the way that laws develop. Laws develop according to the needs of the populations that they're governing, and that's what's being forgotten today by these despotic and dictatorial governments across the Middle East. They are reviving simple black and white rules. As though that's enough to make a legal system. It isn't. The legal system requires legitimacy, it requires mercy, it requires discretion in judges, and these are the things which are not being given. If I can just say, with regard to ISIS, looking at it from another point of view, without just drawing comparisons, straightforward comparisons between ISIS and Saudi, what ISIS is doing is a very straightforward exercise in terms of that process that I've just described. They're just doing it backwards. They want to show that they are in control. One of the main attributes of statehood throughout history has always been the right to punish, the right to monopolize the use of force. To say that no one else can punish, it's going to be
ruling by fear.
It's going to be the rule. We rule and we decide who can be punished and when they can be punished. So it is showing the people under its control and showing the wider world that we are running the show now. We have a judicial system. We have, obviously, they're also saying they have an economic system and a social system as well. But it's quite interesting. They've actually very recently promulgated a penal code. So they're saying, and it isn't just that they're not just pointing at the Quran and the Hadith. They're actually listing the crimes which shall be punished and the ways that they shall be punished, which incidentally, as I mentioned in my book, is something which would have been heretical in the early years of Islam, because in the early years of Islam, it was the only book that counted was the Quran and the collections of Hadiths. It wasn't for a ruler to draw up law codes.
A penal code would be heretical.
No, it was utterly heretical. The very first person to suggest it was actually executed for doing it.
Is there something that surprises you in that penal code?
Not really. No, it's a very simplistic penal code. It draws on the most hardline interpretations of the HUD crimes, of the mandatory penalties in the Quran, like for example in Islamic jurisprudence, like for example adultery, zina.
Yes.
In the Quran itself, the Quran itself specifies that the punishment for adultery should be 100 lashes. As a result of the development of Islamic jurisprudence, it was agreed among certain scholars that no, it should be more than that. It should be stoning as well. But the Quran itself is pretty clear. The Quran says 100 lashes, but ISIS ignores that. ISIS goes for the tougher penalty, as it does in the case of all.
Okay, so there is a hierarchy of penalties. So stonings, lashings.
Well, there's disagreement. There's always been disagreement. There's contradictions. There's ambiguities. You know, we're human beings. That's what happens when we try and work out perfection. But as far as ISIS is concerned, there is no ambiguity. You know, they're human beings as well, but they don't seem to recognise that. They seem to think they're gods.
Great. Well, Zaid, actually, I wanted to ask you, evidence shows that the majority of crimes people are executed for in the Middle East are actually petty crimes, such as drug smuggling and even sorcery. How is this justified according to the law, Sharia law?
Well, it depends on which Sharia law you're talking about. It depends on which interpretation you're actually talking about. It actually differs. But in the case of actually exacting or carrying out such capital punishment by executing those, I don't believe that those should be used against those crimes. I do believe that the whole Quran and Islamic civilization is about mercy, punishment to deter, and it would be criminals to stop them in their tracks, to prevent them. It's all more about preventative measures, educating, enlightening society, but at the same time, if the worst comes to the worst, and as a last resort, these punishments are desperately needed, and particularly, as I said, like crimes which are committed on a massive scale, like killings that happened in Iraq, that sort of thing. These are not ordinary crimes. These are genocidal crimes with intent of, let's say, committing not ethnic but sectarian cleansing to entire areas. And these are totally different crimes than the petty crimes you mentioned. There has to be a deterrence which matches the severity of the crime. I mean, that's the way I look at it. I do not, for one...
Sadakat.
So sorry, yeah, if I could just interject to that point. Of course. I mean, I do think it's quite... The idea that capital punishments deter is often cited as justification for the capital punishments, but there are no studies which actually prove that. I mean, if you look at crime rates in different countries, they vary hugely. I mean, the murder rate is relatively low in Saudi Arabia, so I'm sure a Saudi would say, well, that's because we behead people and we deter people. But I think it's 0.8 people per 100,000 or something. In Iraq, it's almost 10 times that amount. So what's going on in Iraq? Is capital punishment clearly isn't working. In Pakistan, which is a very violent society, though in a different way from Iraq, it's also a very, very, very high crime rate, and they are one of the biggest historically they've been one of the biggest death penalty states as well. There isn't evidence to show that capital punishment does deter. That's the problem with that argument.
Okay, well, we've got to move on to Skype. Over Skype now from Jordan is Adam Kugel, Middle East researcher at Human Rights Watch. Adam, looking at the number of executions that have taken place in Saudi Arabia from 2011 to 13, the figures seem pretty consistent. 2013, there's 79. 2012, there's 79 deaths. 2011, 82. And numbers in Iran are higher, but they also seem to follow the same trend. 2013, 624 deaths. 2012, 580. 2011, 676. Do you think that these countries are following a quota system?
I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of speculation about that over the years, especially with Saudi Arabia. The numbers do tend to range from between 70 to 90 for whatever reason. I do think it is very important to point out, though, that for 2014, there was actually a very low execution rate for the first part of the year. So there were only 15 executions between January and the beginning of August. And then for whatever reason, at the beginning of August, the rate increased significantly to the extent that we had 87 executions by the end of the year. And I think it's important to point out that this year, those rates have continued to be quite high. We've had, just in the first 22 days of January, 13 executions by my count.
Okay.
And if they continue at that rate, they're certainly going to break the record.
Yeah, I was actually going to refer to what happened last August in Saudi Arabia, the 19 beheadings in 17 days and 8 for non-violent offences. I mean, what actually happened there? Why the sudden spate of killings?
Yeah, I mean, there's been speculation that it could have been a quota that they needed to reach, or that they were reviewing, executions internally. I don't think that anyone really knows the answer, but it is clear that at the beginning of August, they began to execute people in significantly higher numbers. I should also point out that the rate of execution in Saudi Arabia for non-violent crimes is incredibly high. For
How
nonviolent
high?
crimes, so for 2014, there were 87 total executions. 41 of them were for drug offenses, right? And then there was one for sorcery. So, I mean, I think it's really important to point out that, the death penalty is bad enough. Public beheadings of people are bad enough, but under international human rights laws and treaties and conventions, it's very clear that execution should only be carried out for the most serious crimes. And I think it's very difficult to argue that nonviolent crimes such as drug distribution, drug smuggling, things like that should be executable offenses.
At the end of last year, Jordan ended an 8-year moratorium on executions. Why has Jordan reinstated the death penalty?
Well, what the officials here say, and first of all, I want to emphasize that the end of the 8-year moratorium was a shock to everybody here in Amman. We knew the government was reviewing its policy, but we did not know that they had in fact decided to go forward. So they sort of carried out these 11 executions in early December, kind of early in the morning, and made an announcement, and it was quite shocking. What public officials here say is that they were under pressure from the public to show that they were taking steps to combat crime. So it's the deterrence argument that they made.
So is the public?
That's what the officials say. I don't think we necessarily, have reliable information, and I'm not sure that.
Because figures said that they were in favor of it being changed. But yes, as you say, how reliable is the information?
Yeah, I mean, there were certainly a lot of vocal members of parliament who were calling for reinstating the death penalty. I don't know necessarily what the crime statistics are in Jordan, but there is at least a perception among the public that crime has increased and that violent crime has increased. So, it's certain that there were some people who were in favor of executions, but the officials here are basically hiding behind what they view as public opinion.
I mean, has this done anything to affect Jordan's reputation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, there were a lot of countries, particularly the European countries here in Jordan, their missions were quite active in working on this issue and pushing Jordan to make its unofficial de facto moratorium permanent. And none of them had any idea that the government was planning to do this. So I do think Jordan's reputation took a hit. You saw the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights come out with a statement very quickly calling on the Jordanians to reinstate the moratorium. And in fact, I want to point out that the UN High Commissioner himself is a Jordanian prince, Zaid bin Raad. So I think that was, pretty important for him to do that. And I think, certainly Jordan's human rights reputation took a hit when it decided to bring back executions.
And how often are innocent people condemned to death?
Well, it's very difficult, especially for a country like Saudi Arabia, for us to, know sort of, with any precision how many innocent people have been wrongfully executed. I can say for sure that, we have worked on cases, death penalty cases in Saudi Arabia, where the person who was later executed claimed that they were tortured. And we have seen, evidence in trials, reading trial documents showing that the judge did not investigate those allegations, did not, look seriously into whether the person who he sentenced to death was actually tortured into providing a confession. So I think that those are pretty serious problems that definitely need to be looked at. I can just also provide an example in Jordan. Okay. Human Rights Watch found an example of a murder in the 1990s where they executed a man for the murder in 2000, and then later in 2005, another man confessed to it. And the court, for no reason whatsoever, disregarded his confession, presumably because they knew they had already executed the wrong man. So these things certainly happen, and this is why my organization and other human rights organizations oppose the death penalty, because of its cruelty and its finality. I mean,
so you believe they had forced him into confessing?
That's what he claimed.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not in a position to say one way or another, but I mean, that's what he claimed. And for example, in this case, the man who later confessed did not claim that he was tortured, and his confession was disallowed on grounds that, are very unclear.
Sadakat, I think you wanted to add a point.
Yeah, Adam, it's a point, but it's also a question. I mean, like you, I think that one of the worst things about the death penalty is the arbitrariness of it and the randomness with which it's imposed. I mean, if there were clear and concrete evidence that it worked, then it would be pretty difficult to argue against it in certain circumstances, but there isn't. And I'm just curious, there's a well-known case over here in England of a character called Abu Qatada, who was eventually deported back to Jordan, and to everyone's surprise, he was then acquitted. But even though it had been argued on his behalf over here that he was going to be tortured and that he was hated by the state and all the rest of it. And I just wondered, that just gives rise to my question, how independent is the judiciary over there, and how much does it bend to the will or of the executive and to the interests of the executive?
Well, first of all, I think you have to be very careful. I mean, I think it does vary from country to country. I would say, for example, in Jordan, while the judiciary is not completely independent, it certainly is affected by politics, but it probably is a little bit more independent than it is in other countries.
Right.
With regards to the Abu Qatada case specifically, I actually worked quite a bit on that case and attended at least half of the trial sessions. And I can tell you that was a case, it's not a good example case as far as, evaluating, the Jordanian judiciary, because there was such an international spotlight.
Right.
There were international journalists there the entire time. I think to really get a sense of, how the judiciary behaves, especially that court, which is Jordan's, security court, state security court, you need to see less high-profile cases to get a better sense of it.
Okay, thanks.
Adam, what happens to victims' families? Are they forced to flee? I mean, is there a social stigma attached to that?
I think, yeah, I think that there certainly is some social stigma attached. A lot of these, for example, someone who's convicted of sorcery or somebody who's convicted of drug smuggling, it's probably, true that the reputation of the family would be hurt in some way. For one of the executions in 2014 that I worked on, the family basically, had been kind of more or less, the nuclear family had more or less ostracized by their tribe, and they weren't getting any support, which is one of the reasons they said they were looking towards people outside, like international organizations, to come and try to help them and advocate on their behalf. I think for Saudi Arabia, though, on this particular issue of social stigma, it's important to point out that in any given year, the majority of people executed in the country are Saudi citizens, but there's the rate of executions of non-Saudis is quite high, actually.
I see.
So yeah, so I think that's important to keep in mind when you're looking at these numbers and whether or not there's social stigma attached.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Adam Kugel, for your expertise.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Actually, I want to go back to the public executions, and is this a form of, say, a gladiatorial match or a spectator sport?
Well, it's not a very gladiatorial match, is it? Because, there's all the powers on one side. So it's a very unfair gladiatorial match. But it certainly is a public sport. Saudi Arabia, there's not very much to do on the streets in Saudi Arabia. I think there's one cinema throughout the kingdom, which shows scientific documentaries, apparently. If you want to see something on the streets in Saudi Arabia, if there's an execution going on, of course it's going to be of interest. But it's fairly disgusting,
interesting
really,
that you can't film it. Yet
no, absolutely.
It's a
absolutely. If the government's proud of it, if the government thinks that this is justice manifest, then why doesn't it film it and show it to the world? The reason it doesn't is because it's ashamed, and it should be ashamed of what it does.
It's ashamed. It's not proud.
No, I don't think it is proud. It wants to show its citizens that it is in control. And this isn't just Saudi, this is any country which stages public executions, and there are 4 of them in the world. But a government which does that basically wants to show its citizens that it's in control. But if it really wanted to show the world that it was upholding justice and it believed that what it was doing was just, then why on earth wouldn't it want to film the executions and show them to everyone? And Saudi Arabia doesn't want to do that. It criminalizes someone who films them instead.
Definitely the public execution is used as an arena or a theater for people within the country to see what's going to happen to them, to deter them, to scare them off, to frighten them off, and certainly to show show them that there is a heavy price to be paid for simply defying the authorities or standing up to them, or simply demanding the basic human rights, like for example, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of the religion, freedom to demonstrate, which is non-existent in Saudi Arabia. There is a clear case of the Eastern Province. When people have demonstrated in 2012, they have been shot on the spot, with the authorities claiming that there was always an exchange of fire between innocent, peaceful protesters and the authorities, who basically are very happy to pull the trigger, to use it as an incitement. There is a political motive there to show that the whole or the entire of Saudi Arabia is under threat because of a growing Shia influence, because the Eastern Province, which is the most rich, or it is the area where all the oil wealth is actually concentrated, is trying to actually to break off from Saudi Arabia. And there is a case actually which points out directly that the judges are actually not being forced or coerced by the authorities. They are actually government employees which carry out the will and the dictates of the king. The king has the ultimate power. It is an absolute monarchy. They cannot defy him. And even the Shura Council that they say is their, a form of parliament, it is handpicked by the king himself. But now, in terms of investigation,
so I'm just going to bring in Sadakat at this point.
Yeah, just one point that I'd like to add to what Zaid has said, which is that it isn't just a method of instilling fear in the population. It's certainly a method of showing that the government is in control, but it is a two-way process. People don't have to be forced to watch these things. They come out of their own free will, and unfortunately very large numbers of them often come out. They enjoy seeing this stuff. It appeals to, many people enjoy seeing it. It appeals to very, very base instincts. It's the kind of voyeuristic appeal that that many people in the West have when these videos are put up. There are plenty of people in the West who watch these appalling videos that are put up on YouTube and other channels, because there is something horribly compelling about seeing torture and seeing sadism and seeing violence being inflicted. It's not something that I would ever do. I've never watched this stuff.
Should the West be doing more to condemn it?
Well, it's not the West. Everyone should be doing stuff to condemn it. It's not the West or any.
We have freer to.
Sure, I'm going to condemn it. I'm in the West. I'm going to condemn it. But and Western governments should condemn it. They should also be aware of their own hypocrisies. I mean, like as has been said a couple of times earlier on during this discussion, the United States still very happily executes people using methods of execution which I regard as inhumane. Until very recently, they were executed. Until 2005, they were executing people for crimes that were committed while they were juveniles. Until about 15 years ago, they were still executing people who were mentally retarded. So we should all be looking at this institution of capital punishment critically, but it's not just the West; it's the Muslim world as well. It's the Chinese. It's wherever this thing happens, people should be looking at it critically.
Zaid, I want to tackle the question I asked in my introduction. Is there a chance of peaceful debate on capital punishment in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, I'm afraid I have to say, to be honest, in some countries you'll face the death penalty yourself, as has been clearly demonstrated by the Saudis. Raif Badawi just established a blog for free debate to discuss the role of religion and politics, and he is being flogged publicly, and I do believe that the Saudi government does enjoy actually bringing people out to see those atrocities being committed, in order not just to scare them off, in order to send a message clearly to the West. Look, we are the most civilized people here. That is the rulers of Saudi Arabia. And that's what they do when they travel to the West. They show off or portray themselves as liberals, as civilized. And they point out to the West, look, everyone inside this country is simply a radical, a hardliner. And if they had the chance, they would behave like ISIL. We are the one running the show. We are the moderates, and those people are the savages. And we've seen what happens in Saudi Arabia. I mean, Amnesty International in Bahrain and Bassiouni's investigation, which was appointed by the King of Bahrain, who is simply now a puppet to the Saudi regime who occupied and invaded the country, has said very clearly that people are being coerced when they are arrested by the security forces. They are tortured, they are threatened, not just themselves, their families are threatened. And we've seen the case of a very high profile Nimr, a leader in Saudi Arabia from the Eastern Province. He simply spoke his mind about freedom, about equality, about the end of the violently sectarian discrimination that the people in the Eastern region are facing with. And he's been put in prison, and he has been, in October this year, he has been sentenced to death for committing absolutely no crime, for just simply asking for democracy, for political reform in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis are somehow reluctant to actually carry out the execution, because they know that there will be some political ramifications in terms of stirring up a sectarian war between Shias and Sunnis in the area.
Okay. Well, Madhav Das Nalapat from Delhi is joining us over the phone. Vice Chair of Malapal Advanced Research Group and Professor of Geopolitics at Malapal University. Professor, do you believe there is room for debate about capital punishment in the Middle East? Do you see any shifts happening?
Well, I do see a shift happening even in Saudi Arabia. The present king of Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that he was not really expected to go into reform, is seeking to change a lot of mindsets in Saudi Arabia. And I would say that the situation there is considerably better in terms of freedoms and human rights than it was about 5 years ago. So even that country is changing. I'd simply like to say that the Holy Quran stresses compassion, it stresses mercy, and that unfortunately is absent in a lot of the Wahhabi teaching, which is frankly, which is the kind of teaching which justifies capital punishment. I do believe a lot of individuals in the Arab world are now talking in terms of going back to the compassion and mercy that is found in the Holy Quran. And from this reformist point of view, I would say the abolition of death penalty is something which I'm certain is being discussed, and I'm certain will become a reality in one of the other Arab countries.
Can I just make
Of course, yes.
Yeah, it's basically, I find it strikingly odd for you to say that there has been an improvement in terms of human rights in Saudi Arabia. Actually, the whole thing have regressed dramatically, and we've seen no concrete evidence that there is freedom or democracy in Saudi Arabia. If you're referring to the Shura Council, they are appointed and handpicked by the king. They are not elected. They do not have any legislative powers. They simply are a rubber stamp. And the municipal elections was boycotted by the Saudi people. Nobody participated because 50% of the people sitting there are handpicked by the government, which carries on with its brutal, savage crackdown in the Eastern Province, and there are thousands of political prisoners who are even denied the chance to go through a fair and transparent court of law.
Professor,
they are denied access
how
to a
would you
lawyer.
respond?
I'd like to respond to that. I'd like to respond by saying that democracy is a 365-day matter. Freedoms are a 365-day matter. For example, we have individuals that talk about human rights, but which believe that women should wear a particular kind of dress, individuals should eat a particular kind of food, and they don't understand that by insisting on that kind of constriction, you're affecting human rights. I quite agree with my friend that Saudi Arabia is one of the worst countries in the world when it comes to human rights. I'm simply saying things are better. I'll give you a small example. In the past, the expatriate community could not even watch movies. Today, they're allowed to watch movies in halls. Of course, far away, there's no real such thing as a movie theater there. Lots of things are happening there which were not happening in the past. I'm talking mainly of the expatriate community, and the expatriate community is seeing that. They, of course, do not vote. I agree with you that the vote is not there. I agree with you that very democratic freedoms are not there. I'm simply saying, compared to what it was 5 years ago, for many people, things are slowly changing for the better. I'm not saying the change is fast enough. I'm simply saying even a small change in a country as regressive as Saudi Arabia, to me, is good news.
Okay, and how about the idea of a secular legal system across the region? Could that be a possibility?
Well, I'd like to imagine that it could be a possibility, and I do imagine that eventually it will have to be a possibility, because the fact of the matter is that Wahhabism is a cancer that is frankly eating into the soul of Islam. And today it is causing this kind of terrorism across the world. It's causing monstrosities such as ISIS, which in my view resembles the Nazi party in Germany. And a lot of young people are joining ISIS, not because of religious reasons, but because they're psychopaths, and they believe that by joining ISIS, they can give full rein to their psychopathic instincts, like many people joined the SS during the Nazi period. So this kind of a situation has shown, quite frankly, where Wahhabism eventually leads to. And I think this is therefore creating a movement for reform. But I agree, it's not a great process, it's a slow process, and the rest of the world, quite frankly, by its tolerance of Wahhabism, and by this absurd belief that Wahhabism represents a quote-unquote pure form of Islam, when it's actually a retrogression, which has nothing to do with the spirit of Islam as given in the Holy Quran. It's a slow process, it's not been satisfactory, but I do believe that ISIS has awoken minds, and it is very, very clear now where Wahhabism is going to lead. And for the first time, we are seeing the mainstream, the moderate majority in the Muslim world say, where are we going?
Okay, well, Sadakat, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to take a step back again. I mean, there's all this talk about Wahhabism as though I mean, of course, it occupies a very central point in this argument, in this debate that we're having now. But the issue isn't only Wahhabism. The issue isn't only ISIS. I mean, the revival of capital punishment and of brutal punishments, which I regard as brutal, like amputation and stoning, began in the 1970s. It began with Zia in Pakistan, and it began with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And the three of the top five, two of the other top five death penalty states are not Wahhabi. They're Iraq and Iran, as I've mentioned. There is something about the modern Islamic revival which is causing a problem, and you're completely correct to say that the traditions of mercy and compassion, which are inherent in the Quran, are being underemphasized. And it's very, very important that I take this view, and this is the view that I talk about in my book. It's very, very important that these get stressed more in the Muslim world. But I mean, that isn't going to lead, going back to the question, Anna, that you were asking earlier on, it isn't going to lead to abolition of the death penalty. I mean, the best I think that one can hope for is a moratorium on the death penalty, and a stressing of the concepts like mercy and like compassion, the injunctions of the Prophet that, that where there's a doubt, the mandatory penalties shouldn't be imposed, and that judges should strain not to impose the mandatory penalties in Islamic jurisprudence.
Yeah. May I cut in here, please?
Yes, of course.
I'd just like to point out there are two countries. In fact, the President and Prime Minister of these countries are going to meet on the 25th. That's the United States and India. They're both considered to be democracies, and both, unfortunately, have the death penalty. So it's not simply in the Arab world that we have the death penalty, but the United States is not part of the Arab world. India is certainly not part of the Arab world, but both these countries have the death penalty. It's not an issue just common to the Arab countries.
No,
the problem is, frankly, that we hold the Arab countries to a different standard. We hold them to a much lower standard than we hold India or the United States, and this is wrong.
Well, no,
we should hold them to the same standard.
I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I hold them to the same standard. I think that I think
I'm talking about mainstream media in general. I'm not talking about individuals like you who are quite obviously one in a million.
Well, I mean, I think that what one should be doing is holding them to the same standard. I mean, the United States is absolutely inhumane in some of its death penalty policies, I take the view. But I'm not one in a million. There are plenty of people who, in this country, in Europe and across the world, who would take the view that both Saudi Arabia and the United States have lost their way when it comes to criminal justice in terms of capital punishment. The danger of setting up those oppositions is to say, well, because the United States isn't doing something, therefore we shouldn't focus on the Arab world. I don't think the Arab world should be the only focus.
That's not at all what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying the death penalty is evil. It's ugly. I fully agree with you. But I'm simply like to say, I wouldn't like to just put it as, I mean, the sense that, as you very correctly said, we got to treat everybody with the same yardstick. And my point is that what's happening in the Arab world today, I mean, it gives me hope that there is a renewal taking place, there's a reconsideration taking place. And I'm talking as a citizen of a country where several million of my fellow citizens are working there and working peacefully and living peacefully there.
Professor Madhav Das Nalapat, thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Zaid, surely there must be better ways of preventing crime than through fear in the region.
Definitely. I mean, as I said, it's a long-term thing. It's a long-term process. It has to be education, and there has to be consistency so that the people who are actually educating, the authorities themselves, the regime themselves, should actually practice what they preach. You cannot teach people in books or in textbooks things that the entire system is basically not implementing on the ground, not carrying out. There has to be cultural reform all along. And the Islamic world has a duty to point the finger of the blame and say, look, the West is always saying Muslim extremists, Muslim fundamentalists. It has a name, although some people do not agree. That's entirely up to them. But us in the Muslim world know that the Wahhabi Salafi radical ideology is there because of Saudi money, which has actually pumped billions of dollars of petrodollar to actually use it as a solid foundation to rely upon to give them legitimacy. One thing which is very important, the Muslim Brotherhood, although it's been declared as a terrorist by the Saudis, believes in actually getting to power through the ballot box, believes in democracy and election. The one thing that turned the Saudi against them, and they are both Sunnis, the Muslim Brotherhood are Sunni, just because they said, we believe in democracy. Now, according to the Wahhabi Salafi ideology, and that's why it's pivotal to the Saudi regime, you are not allowed to stand up or defy the leader, no matter what crimes or whatever he does to the community. You're not allowed to stand up to him. That is strictly forbidden. And by the way, when we talk about Iraq, most of the terrorists have been exported to Iraq. We have an exportation system, well, not only the ideology exported by Saudi Arabia, but actually radical extremist fighters. And that has been confirmed even by the Americans. According to NBC, more than 50% of the hardline fighters who came to Iraq, that was during the 2000s, were actually from Saudi Arabia. Most of the suicide bombings came actually from Saudi Arabia, and that's exactly the case in Syria. That's exactly what happened in Syria. There are cases in Saudi Arabia where a judge has specifically told a defendant, why are you doing these things in Saudi Arabia? Why don't you travel? And a case in court is by his father simply complaining about that judge. They are being exported because there is under the encouragement or tacit role of the authorities by encouraging them to go there rather than carry out those heinous crimes in Saudi Arabia, carry them out in order to fulfill the foreign policy of Saudi Arabia.
And I just have my final questions to Sadakat. What steps need to be taken to pave the way for a peaceful discussion about this in the area?
A peaceful discussion? Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there are tools within Islamic jurisprudence that one can use. I mean, I've mentioned a couple of them already, but there are hadiths which make clear that a judge, when considering a contested issue of Islamic jurisprudence, should strain not to impose a mandatory penalty if it's at all possible. There are evidential safeguards. Some of the earliest evidential safeguards in legal history, in fact, were developed when the Quran was handed down. there are traditions of mercy and compassion that we've been hearing about, which could be focused, which could be focused upon. The problem at the moment with the kinds of Islamic jurisprudence that we've been talking about is that judges are effectively required to punish, but they're almost forbidden to forgive, which is absurd. It flies in the face of 1400 years of Islamic history. And I think that it's those traditions within Islamic history itself that need to be focused upon, because one's bashing one's head against a brick wall if one campaigns for immediate abolition of the death penalty in the Middle East or the Muslim world, because it isn't going to achieve popular support. There are genuine fears that are held by people. There are cynical political interests which are held by rulers, which mean that the death penalty is going to remain. But there are arguments, there are better and worse arguments for minimising its application, and I think the better arguments should be focused upon.
Okay. Well, as we have seen today, capital punishment is not without its complexities and is a topic that gathers emotional responses. Even in the West, where the death penalty is not accepted, when it comes to murder, rape or the massacre of school children, one could be forgiven for considering the idea of reinstating the death penalty. However, on the other end of the spectrum, being killed for one's religious beliefs, drug smuggling or sorcery seem a cruel interpretation of the legal system. It makes one wonder how many innocent lives are lost in the bid to control a nation through fear. I'd like to thank all my guests on today's show: Lina Khatib, Professor Madhav Das-Nalapat, Adam Kugel, and of course with me here in the studio, Middle East analyst Zayed Alisa and human rights barrister Sadakat Kadri. Thank you so much for your expertise and views.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Until next time, goodbye.